Catharan moved through the burning corridors like a ghost of war. His bare feet made no sound on the metal floors, and his forearms were ready for combat. Despite the wounds that still marked his body, he followed the sounds of weapons fire and screaming, and found a trail of destruction that led toward the heart of the station. Dead guards lay scattered along the route, and Catharan recognized the wounds. The purifiers had been thorough. They had left no survivors. He pushed deeper into the chaos and encountered a group of station security forces pinned down behind a barricade. They raised their weapons when they saw him, but he held up his hands and spoke. Quickly he told them he was there to help. He told them he knew the attackers and could stop them if they would let him pass. The security commander was a Rylaxian with half her face burned from a plasma blast. She stared at Catharan with hatred in her eyes and told him that she would rather die than accept help from Vara scum. Then Yuna appeared behind the barricade. She had escaped from the guards who were evacuating her and had followed the sounds of battle against all common sense. She told the security commander that Catharan could be trusted. She told them that he was their best chance of stopping the purifiers before they reached the reactor. The commander looked from Yuna to Catharan and back again. Then she lowered her weapon and stepped aside. Catharan nodded once and moved past the barricade into the smoke and fire beyond. Yuna started to follow, but he turned and told her to stay back. She refused. She told him that she had staked her life on the Varth prisoners, and she would see this through to the end. Wanted to argue, but there was no time together. They advanced toward the reactor chamber. The purifiers had established a defensive position outside the main reactor doors. 7 warriors remained from the original group of 12, and they fought with the desperate fury of those who had already accepted death. Catharan recognized their fighting style and their tactics. He had trained many of them himself. At the center of the group stood Draxal. Purifier leader was massive, even by Vorith standards, with ritual scars covering his scales and eyes that burned with fanatical conviction. He saw Catharan approaching and let out a roar of rage. He called Catharan a traitor and a coward. He said that Catharan had betrayed everything the Vorith stood for by begging mercy from their enemies. He said that death was the only honorable path left for their people, and that he would deliver that death to everyone on this station. Catharan stopped a dozen paces from his former second in command. He told Draxel that he had been a fool for most of his life. He told him that they had all been fools. They had believed the lies of their government and killed millions of innocent beings for a cause that never existed. The war had been built on deception, and their honor had been stolen from them long before they ever raised weapons against the council. But there was still a chance to reclaim something. There was still a chance to prove that the Varth were more than weapons. One human had shown him this truth. One small creature from a minor world had treated him with more dignity than his own people ever had. She had offered her life to give the Varath prisoners a second chance, and Catharan would not let that sacrifice be wasted. Draxel laughed and called Yuna weak and pathetic. Said that humans were parasites who had infected Catharan's mind with their sickness. He said that he would kill the human first and make Catharan watch before he finished his mission. Then Draxel attacked. The two Varath warriors collided with the force of colliding starships. Their forearms grappled and struck and tore at each other, while the other purifiers tried to get clear shots at Catharan without hitting their leader. Yuna dove for cover as plasma bolts scorched the air around her. She had no weapons and no combat training, but she refused to run. Catharan was wounded and exhausted from days of captivity, while Draxel was fresh and driven by fanatical rage. The fight was brutal and bloody. They crashed through equipment and bounced off walls and left trails of dark blood on the floor. Catharan felt his strength fading as old injuries reopened and new wounds accumulated. Radril sensed his weakness and pressed the advantage. He pinned Catharan against the wall and began to crush the life out of him. He whispered that this was the end. He whispered that the Varath would be remembered as warriors, not as beggars. He whispered that Ketharan's human friend would die screaming. Then Yuna did something impossible. She stepped out from behind cover and walked directly toward the reactor doors, where one of the purifiers was working to override the safety locks. She walked past the fighting warriors without hesitation. She walked towards certain death. Draxel saw her and released Ketharan in shock. He could not understand what he was seeing. This tiny creature had no weapons and no armor and no chance of survival yet. She walked toward him without fear. Yuna stopped directly in front of Draxel and looked up into his burning eyes. She told him that his death would not bring back what the Varath had lost. She told him that destroying this station would only prove that his enemies were right about his people. She told him that he had a choice. He could die as a monster and condemn his entire species to being remembered as monsters forever, or he could live and help build something new. She told him that humans had almost destroyed themselves. Many times throughout their history, they had waged wars and committed atrocities and brought their world to the edge of extinction, but they had also learned to forgive and to rebuild and to become better than they were. The Varath could do the same if they chose to try. Draxel stared at this human who spoke to him without hatred or contempt. His hand trembled as he raised it to strike her down, but he hesitated. That moment of hesitation, Ketharan struck, drove his fist into the base of Draxel's skull with all his remaining strength. The purifier leader collapsed and did not rise. The other purifiers saw their leader fall in their resolve. Shattered station security forces swarmed into the chamber and overwhelmed them in seconds. Was over. The reactor was safe. The station was saved. Ketharan fell to his knees beside Draxel's unconscious body and felt the last of his strength drain away. Yuna knelt beside him and placed her hand on his arm. Just as she had done in the interrogation chambers, she told him that he had proven everything she believed about him. She told him that the galaxy had just witnessed a Varath warrior choose mercy over destruction. She told him that this was only the beginning. 6 months later, Ketharan stood on a hillside overlooking the first joint human Varath colony, the settlement. Spread across a green valley on a world that neither species had claimed, children played in the streets below. Some were human and some were Varath, and they ran together without fear or hatred. Yuna stood beside him and watched the sun set behind the distant mountains. She told him that the Council had finally completed their investigation into the weapons transfers that had sparked the war. They had found evidence of a conspiracy by a faction within the Varath government working with outside interests to manufacture the conflict. The truth was spreading across the galaxy. Varath people were beginning to understand that they had been used. Some refused to accept it. Some clung to the old hatreds and the old lies, but others were ready to build something new. Ketharan turned to Yuna and told her that he had spent his whole life as a weapon. He had killed and destroyed and never questioned his purpose, but she had shown him that there was another way. She had taught him that strength without compassion was just violence, and that true courage meant being willing to change. He told her that he would spend the rest of his life passing on that lesson. He would teach the young Varath that their worth was not measured in battles won or enemies killed. He would teach them that the greatest victory was earning the trust of those who had every reason to hate. Yuna smiled and told him that this was what humans called hope. It was fragile and easily broken, but it was also the most powerful force in the universe, because hope could transform enemies into friends. Hope could turn weapons into healers. Hope could build bridges between species that had once tried to destroy each other, and hope had brought them here to this hillside. Watching children play in the fading light, the galaxy was still dangerous and full of those who chose hatred over understanding. But on this small world, in this quiet valley, something new was growing, something that would spread and change everything. All because one human had reached out her hand to a monster, and the monster had chosen to reach back. The council chamber had never been so loud. Delegates shouted over each other in a dozen languages while translation systems struggled to keep pace with the chaos. Ambassador Chun pushed through the crowd and grabbed Yuna by the arm, demanding to know if she had lost her mind. She told him that her mind was perfectly clear. She told him that this was the only option left. Arbiter called for order, and the noise gradually subsided into a tense silence. He looked at Yuna with an expression that mixed disbelief with something that might have been respect. He told her that the tradition of surety was ancient and had not been invoked in the galactic courts for over 1,000 years. He asked her if she understood what she was offering. Yuna confirmed that she understood completely. If the prisoners were released and even one of them committed an act of violence, then she would forfeit her life. The Arbiter warned her that the Vorath were unpredictable and dangerous. He warned her that she was betting her existence on creatures that had destroyed worlds. He warned her that the Council would not hesitate to carry out her execution if the terms were violated. Yuna told him that she accepted all of these conditions. The chamber fell silent again. Then something unexpected happened. The Mindari ambassador rose from his seat. His compound eyes glittered with an emotion that Yuna could not read. As he addressed the assembly, he said that he had lost his daughter to the Vorath, said that he had wanted nothing more than to see every prisoner executed slowly and painfully. But he said that watching this human offer her life for creatures that had never shown her kindness had stirred something in his heart. He said that the Mindari had ancient teachings about mercy that he had forgotten in his grief. He said that if this human could find the courage to believe in redemption, then perhaps he could find the courage to allow for its possibility. He announced that the Mindari delegation would support the surety proposal. The Rylaxian ambassador stood immediately and condemned this decision as weakness and betrayal, but other voices began to speak in support of the proposal. The Gathri delegate noted that executing the prisoners would accomplish nothing except satisfying a desire for revenge. The excellent representative pointed out that studying the rehabilitation of Vorath soldiers could provide valuable insights for future conflicts. One by one, the delegations weighed in until the Arbiter called for a formal vote. The result was closer than anyone expected. By a margin of just 7 votes, the Council agreed to accept Yuna's surety and release the prisoners into human custody. The executions were cancelled. 3,000 Vorath soldiers would live, but the victory was fragile. The prisoners would be transported to a human rehabilitation facility on a distant moon where they would undergo psychological treatment and education. They would be monitored constantly, and any sign of violence would trigger immediate consequences for both the offender and for Yunash. Had saved their lives, but her own now hung by the thinnest of threads. Guards escorted Yuna to the holding cells so she could inform the prisoners of their fate. When she arrived, she found Catharan waiting at the front of his cell with his face pressed against the energy barrier. He had heard the broadcast of her surety declaration and had spent the last hour trying to understand what had happened. He asked her why she had done either. Asked her why she would risk everything for strangers who had caused so much suffering. Yuna told him that humans had a saying. She told him that faith without works was dead. She said that it was easy to believe in redemption when it cost nothing. The true test of faith came when you had to put something real on the line. She said that she believed that the Vorath prisoners could become more than weapons. She believed that they could learn and grow and contribute to the galaxy in positive ways, and she was willing to stake her life on that belief. Catharan stared at her through the barrier and felt his twin hearts pounding in his chest. No one had ever shown him such trust. No one had ever believed in him so completely. Told her that he would not fail her. He told her that he would spend the rest of his life proving that her faith was not misplaced. Yuna smiled and told him that she was counting on it. Then the station shook with the force of a massive explosion. Alarms screamed through the corridors, and emergency lights bathed everything in red. Yuna stumbled and caught herself against the wall as guards rushed past shouting into their communicators' reports, came flooding in through the intercom system. A group of Vorath prisoners had broken free from a different holding section on the far side of the station. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were members of an extremist faction called the Purifiers, who believed that surrender was worse than death. Purifiers had somehow obtained weapons and were fighting their way through the station toward the main reactor. If they reached the reactor and caused a meltdown, the explosion would destroy the entire station and kill everyone aboard, including the council members who had just voted to spare Vorath lives. The guards began evacuating the holding area and ordering all prisoners to remain in their cells. Catherine called out to Una as she was pushed toward the exit. He told her that he knew the Purifiers. He told her that their leader was a warrior named Draxel, who had been his second in command during the war. He told her that Draxel would rather die than accept mercy from the species he considered enemies, and he would take as many others with him as possibly. Una asked the guards to release Catherine so he could help stop the attackers. They refused immediately. They told her that releasing a Vorath prisoner during an attack by Vorath extremists was insanity. They told her that Catherine was probably working with the Purifiers, and this was all part of some elaborate plan. Una argued, but the guards would not listen. They dragged her away and left Catherine alone in his cell. He stood in the darkness and listened to the sounds of battle echoing through the station. He thought about Una and the faith she had placed in him. He thought about the 3,000 prisoners whose lives now depended on the actions of a few extremists. He thought about what would happen if the Purifiers succeeded. The council would blame all Vorath for the attack. They would execute the prisoners, and Una along with them. Everything she had sacrificed would be for nothing. Catherine made his decision. He was still a warrior even in chains. He had spent his entire life learning how to fight and how to survive. The energy shackles on his wrists were designed for standard prisoners, not for a Vorath fleet commander who had been trained in 100 forms of combat. He twisted his body in a way that would have broken the bones of any other species and felt the shackles strain against his scales. Pain shot through his arms, but he kept pushing. The shackles sparked and smoked and finally shattered. He was free. The cell door was another matter, but Catherine had noticed a weakness in the barrier generator during his time in captivity. He struck the precise point where the power conduit met the frame, and the barrier flickered and died. He stepped out into the corridor and began moving toward the sounds of battle. He was not running away. He was running toward the only thing that mattered. He had to stop Draxel, had to prove that Una's faith was not misplaced. He had to show the galaxy that a Vorath could choose mercy over destruction, and he would do it or die trying. Una SEO had 12 hours to save 3,000 lives, and she intended to use every second. She started with the Mendari delegation because they had suffered greatly during the war, and their voice carried weight in the council chambers. The Mendari ambassador received her in his quarters with cold formality. His compound eyes reflected no warmth as he listened to her arguments. Una told him about her conversation with Catherine. She explained that the Vorath soldiers had been manipulated by their own leadership and fed lies about council aggression. She argued that executing prisoners who had been deceived into fighting would only perpetuate the cycle of violence. The ambassador let her finish, and then he showed her something. He activated a holographic display that filled the room with images of destruction. Saw the sacred temples of Mendara burning. She saw priests and scholars running through the flames as Vorath soldiers cut them down. She saw children screaming for their parents. In the smoke and chaos, the ambassador told her that his own daughter had died in that attack. She had been a temple acolyte studying the ancient texts that the Vorath reduced to ash. He told Una that he understood her compassion, but that some crimes were beyond forgiveness. Then he asked her to leave. The Rylaxian delegation refused to see her at all. Their ambassador sent a message through an aide, stating that any human who advocated for Vareth Mercy was no friend of the Rylaxian people, the Thorvan. Representatives laughed when she requested a meeting. They told her that humans were too young and too naive to understand how the galaxy truly worked. Yuna pressed on despite the rejections. She visited delegation after delegation and made her case. To anyone who would listen, most would not. The few who did listen responded with variations of the same answer. The Voreth had caused too much pain. Justice demanded blood after 6 hours of failure. Yuna returned to her own delegation's quarters, hoping to find allies among her fellow humans. Instead, she found opposition ambassador. Chun called an emergency meeting and confronted her in front of the entire Earth delegation. He told her that her actions were damaging humanity's standing with the Council. Earth had worked for decades to build relationships with the established powers of the galaxy. Those relationships were now at risk because one junior diplomat had decided to champion the most hated species in known space. Chun ordered her to stop, he told her to issue a public statement distancing herself from her earlier advocacy. He told her that humanity's future in the galactic community was more important than her personal crusade. Yuna listened to his words and felt the weight of what he was asking. He was not wrong about the political consequences. Earth was still a newcomer to the galactic stage and could not afford to alienate powerful allies, but she thought about Ketharan sitting alone in his cell waiting to die. She thought about 3,000 prisoners who might have been good people once before their government turned them into weapons. She thought about her grandfather and the second chance that had transformed him from a broken soldier into a force for healing. She told Ambassador Chun that she could not stop. She told him that if humanity abandoned its principles, the moment those principles became inconvenient, then those principles meant nothing. She told him that Earth had joined the galactic community not just to gain power and influence, but to share the values that had allowed humans to survive their own violent history, compassion and redemption, and the belief that people could change if humanity could not stand for those values when it mattered most. Then, what was the point of standing at all? Chun stared at her for a long moment, and then he shook his head. He told her that she was on her own. The Earth delegation would not support her and would not protect her from the consequences of her actions. Yuna accepted this and left to continue her work. With only 4 hours remaining, she changed her approach. Instead of appealing to the delegation, she began searching the Council archives for any information that might support her case. She worked through the night with her eyes burning from staring at data screens and her hands trembling from too much stimulant tea. And then she found something buried deep in the intelligence reports from the early days of the war. Was a series of intercepted communications. Messages were fragmentary and heavily encrypted, but the analysis teams had managed to decode portions of them. The communications revealed that the Vareth leadership had received weapons and tactical data from an unknown third party in the months before the war began. Someone had armed the Vareth, Somion, had given them the technology to fight the Council. Someone had wanted this war to happen. Yuna compiled her findings and requested an emergency session with the full Council. The Arbiter granted her request with obvious reluctance. She stood before the assembled representatives of 100 worlds and presented her evidence. She argued that the Vareth soldiers were not just perpetrators, but also victims of a larger conspiracy. She asked the Council to delay the executions until a full investigation could determine who had manipulated both sides into this conflict. The response was immediate and hostile. The Relaxian ambassador accused her of fabricating evidence to save her new Vorth. Friends, the Mandari delegate, called her presentation an insult to everyone who had lost loved ones in the war. Even species that had remained neutral throughout the conflict dismissed her claims as desperate speculation. Arbiter thanked her for her presentation and then announced that the vote would proceed as scheduled. The executions would begin at dawn. Yuna had failed. She stood alone in the empty council chamber after the delegations departed and felt the weight of 3,000 lives pressing down on her shoulders. She had tried everything, and it had not been enough. Then, she remembered something her grandfather had told her before he died. He had said that when all other options were exhausted, a person must be willing to risk everything for what they believed. He had said that sometimes the only way to change the world was to put yourself between the hammer and the nail. Yuna made her decision. She returned to the council chamber and activated the emergency broadcast system. Her voice echoed through every corridor and compartment of the massive station. She invoked an ancient human legal tradition called surety. Under this tradition, a person could stake their own life as guarantee for the behavior of another. She declared herself surety for all 3,000 Varth prisoners if the council would spare their lives and release them into human custody for rehabilitation. Then she would accept responsibility for their actions if even one prisoner caused harm after release. Then Yuna herself would be executed in their place. The station erupted in chaos. Delegates rushed back to the chamber shouting questions and objections. Her fellow humans tried to reach her and talk her out of this madness, but Yuna stood firm at the podium and waited for the council's response. She had nothing left to offer except her own life, and she was willing to give it. The interrogation chamber was built for creatures much larger than Yuniseo. The chair they brought for her looked like a toy compared to the massive restraint frame where Ketharan sat with his forearms locked in place and his legs secured to. The four-armed guards stood at every corner of the room with their weapons trained on the prisoner. They had warned Yuna that the Varath were dangerous even in chains and that she should keep her distance at all times. She ignored them and pulled her small chair closer to the prisoner until she sat just an arm's length away from him. Ketharan watched her with confusion in his one working eye. He had expected questions about military positions and fleet movements and the location of hidden Varath bases. He had prepared himself for threats and pain and manipulation instead. This human asked him about his childhood. The question caught him so off guard that he did not answer at first. He simply stared at her and tried to understand what game she was playing. But there was no deception in her eyes. There was only curiosity and something else that he could not identify, something that looked almost like compassion. So he told her about the spawning pools of Varth Prime, where he had hatched alongside 300 siblings. He told her about the brutal training that began when he was barely old enough to walk. He told her about the endless competitions and fights that determined which young Vorth would rise to become warriors and which would be sent to the labor camps. He told her about his two younger siblings, Methkal and Saravan, who had been too small and too gentle for the warrior path. He had protected them as best he could, but he was just a child himself when the recruiters came to separate the weak from the strong. Ketharan had begged them to spare his siblings. They had laughed at him and taken Methkal and Saravan away. He never saw them again. Yuna listened without interrupting when he finished speaking. She asked him how he had become a fleet commander. Ketharan explained that the Varth military valued only strength and victory. He had risen through the ranks by being the most ruthless and the most effective warrior in every unit he served. He had killed his own officers when they showed weakness. He had ordered attacks on civilian populations when his superiors demanded results. Had done terrible things because that was what the Dominion required of its soldiers. But he had also believed in the cause. The Varath leadership had told their people that the Galactic Council was planning to exterminate their species. They showed footage of Council fleets massing near Varath space. They broadcast intercepted communications that spoke of wiping out the Varath threat once and for all. The war had seemed like a matter of survival, kill or be killed, destroy or be destroyed. Tehran had believed every word because he had no reason to doubt his own government. Yuna nodded slowly, and then she told him something that made his blood run cold. She told him that the council had never planned to attack the Varath. Footage had been fabricated, the communications had been forged. The Entire war had been started by the Vorath leadership-based on lies designed to consolidate their power and expand their territory. Catherine wanted to call her a liar. He wanted to reject everything she said, because accepting it would mean that his entire life had been built on a foundation of deception. But deep inside, he had always suspected the truth. He had seen the confusion on the faces of council civilians when Vorath soldiers invaded their worlds. They had not looked like people preparing for genocide. They had looked like people who had no idea why they were being attacked. He had pushed those doubts aside because a Vorath warrior did not question orders. But now the doubts came flooding back and brought with them a wave of guilt so powerful that he thought it might crush him. Millions of beings had died because of lies, and he had been the weapon that made those deaths possible. Yuna must have seen the anguish in his face, because she did something unexpected. She reached out and placed her small hand on his massive scaled arm. The guards shouted warnings and raised their weapons, but she waved them off. She told Catherine that she understood what it felt like to learn that everything you believed was wrong. She told him about her own family. Her grandfather had been a soldier in a terrible war on Earth many generations ago. He had fought for a nation that told him he was defending his homeland against invaders. He had killed and watched his friends die and committed acts that haunted him for the rest of his life. Only after the war ended did he learn that his own government had lied to him. The enemy had never threatened his homeland. War had been fought for resources and power and the pride of leaders who would never see a battlefield themselves. Her grandfather had spent the rest of his life trying to atone for what he had done. He had become a refugee advocate and helped resettle thousands of people displaced by the very conflict he had helped wage. He had taught Yuna that enemies were often just frightened people following frightened leaders. He had taught her that the capacity for violence and the capacity for redemption existed in the same heart. Catherine listened to her words and felt something shift inside him. No one had ever spoken to him like this. No one had ever treated him as anything other than a monster or a weapon or a tool to be used, and discarded this tiny human from a small and insignificant world, saw something in him that he had not seen in himself for as long as he could. Remember, she saw a person when their hour ended. The guards came to take Yuna away. She stood and looked at Catherine one last time. She told him that she would do everything in her power to save him and the other prisoners. He asked her why. Why would she risk her position and her reputation for creatures that had brought so much suffering to the galaxy? Why would she extend mercy to those who had shown none? Yuna smiled, and the expression transformed her face into something almost luminous. She told him that this was what humans did. They believed in second chances because someone had once given them a second chance. They believed in redemption because they had seen the worst of their own species overcome and transformed. They believed in mercy because mercy was the only thing that could break the cycle of violence and hatred that consumed so many worlds. Then she was gone, and Catherine was alone again in his cell. But something had changed. For the first time since his capture, he did not feel like an animal waiting for slaughter. He felt like a person who might have a future. He felt like someone who might be worth saving. The next morning, the guards came with news. The council had voted all Vorath prisoners would be executed at dawn. The following day, UNSCO had 12 hours to change their minds, and Catherine realized with a shock of fear and hope that he wanted her to succeed. He wanted to live, not because he was afraid of death, but because for the first time in his existence, he wanted to become something more than a weapon. He wanted to become the person that tiny humans seemed to believe he could be. The cell was cold and dark and smelled of blood and defeat. Catherine sat against the metal wall with his 4 arms chained behind his back and his legs bound with energy shackles that hummed with a soft blue light. He had not moved in hours. The great warrior of the Vorath Dominion, who had once commanded a fleet of 200 warships, now sat in a cage like an animal waiting for slaughter. His Scales were cracked and dry from lack of water, and his left eye had swollen shut from the beating the guards had given him when he first arrived, but the physical pain meant nothing to him. Real agony came from inside his chest, where his twin hearts beat with the heavy rhythm of shame. The Vorath had lost the war, not just a battle or a campaign, but the entire war that his people had waged against the Galactic Council for 7 brutal years. Millions of his kind lay dead on dozens of worlds, and the survivors now filled prison cells across the galaxy, waiting to learn their fate. Keth Aaron closed his working eye and remembered the final battle. His flagship had burned around him as Council warships tore through the Vorath formation like predators through wounded prey. He had watched his crew die one by one until only he remained standing on a bridge filled with smoke and fire and the screams of the dying. When the boarding parties came, he had fought them with his bare hands until they finally brought him down with stun weapons and dragged him away in chains. That was 3 days ago now. He sat in this cell aboard the Council flagship and listened to the voices that echoed through the corridors outside. Representatives of a dozen species had gathered to decide what to do with the captured Vorath soldiers Skethron had heard their arguments through the thin walls. The Rylaxian ambassador spoke with cold hatred in her voice, demanding immediate execution for all prisoners. She reminded the council that the Vorath had destroyed 3 of her people's colony worlds and killed over 8 million civilians. The Mandari delegate agreed and added that the Vorath had burned their most sacred temples during the invasion of their home world. His voice shook with rage as he called for the prisoners to be sent to the prison moons of Gathrak, where they would spend the rest of their lives in darkness and isolation. Other voices joined the chorus of condemnation. The Vorath were monsters, they said. The Vorath were animals who knew nothing but violence and destruction. The Vorath deserved no mercy because they had shown none to their victim Sketh. Ran listened to these words and felt something strange happening inside him. For his entire life, he had been taught that the Vorath were the supreme warriors of the galaxy. His people had conquered dozens of worlds and built an empire that stretched across an entire spiral arm. They had never known defeat, and they had never known fear, but now, as he sat in chains and listened to the hatred of his enemies, Ketheran felt both of those things for the first time. He was afraid not of death, because a Vorath warrior did not fear death. He was afraid of being forgotten. He was afraid that his people would vanish from the galaxy, and no one would remember that they had ever existed, except as villains in stories told to frighten children. And in that moment of fear, Ketheran did something that no Vorath had ever done in the entire history of his species. He begged for mercy. The cell had a communication panel on the wall that the guards used to deliver orders to prisoners. Tharan dragged himself across the floor with his chains scraping against the metal and pressed his face against the panel, activated the broadcast function with his teeth, and spoke into the microphone. His voice was rough and broken, but the words came from somewhere deep inside him that he had never known existed. Told the council that he was not asking them to forgive the crimes of his people. He told them that he understood the pain and suffering the Vorath had caused. He told them that he had done terrible things in the war, and that he would carry the weight of those actions for the rest of his life. But he asked them for one thing. He asked them for a chance, not freedom and not forgiveness, but simply a chance to atone. He asked them to let the Vorath prisoners live so that they might spend their remaining years trying to repair some small part of the damage they had caused. He asked them to show the mercy that his own people had never shown. When he finished speaking, the silence that followed was worse than any punishment. Then the voices came through the panel one by one. Rylaxian ambassador laughed and called him a coward who was trying to save his own skin. The Mandari delegate spat curses and said that Vorath words were worthless because Vorath had no honor. The Thorvin representative suggested that the prisoners should be given to their scientists for experimentation, since the Vorath had done the same to captured council Soldier's voice after voice spoke with contempt and hatred. And dismissal. Kethron lowered his head and accepted that he would die in this cell. He had tried and he had failed, and now there was nothing left but to wait for the end. Then a new voice came through the panel. It was softer than the others and spoke with an accent that Kethron did not recognize. The voice belonged to a humankatharan. Had heard of humans, but had never encountered one. They were a young species from a small world called Earth who had only joined the Galactic Council a few decades ago. They were considered weak and unremarkable by most standards, with no natural weapons or armor and short lifespans that barely reached a century. Devarth had ignored them during the war because they seemed like such insignificant creatures. But now this human voice cut through the hatred and contempt like a blade through smoke. The human said that her name was Dr. Unicio and that she served as a diplomatic attaché for the Earth delegation. She said that she had listened to the prisoner's words and that she wished to hear more. She said that she would meet with him. The other delegates erupted in protest. They warned her that Devarth could not be trusted. They told her that she was being foolish and naive. They reminded her that Devarth had killed billions of sentient beings and showed no remorse until they were defeated and captured. But Unicio did not back down. She said that she understood the risks and that she would take full responsibility for her actions. She said that if there was even the smallest chance that these prisoners could be rehabilitated, then someone should explore that chance. She said that this was what humans believed. The council fell silent again. Then the senior arbiter spoke and said that the human could have her meeting. He granted her access to the prisoner for 1 standard hour, but he warned her that this changed nothing. The vote on the fate of the Varth prisoners would proceed as scheduled, and no amount of human sentiment would alter the outcome. Tharn heard footsteps approaching his cell. The door slid open and light flooded into the darkness. Squinted with his one good eye and saw a small figure standing in the doorway. Unicio was shorter than he had expected. She barely reached the middle of his chest, and her frame was slender and fragile, looking compared to his massive scaled body. She had dark hair pulled back from her face and eyes that seemed to hold no fear, despite standing before a creature that had killed hundreds of her fellow beings. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she did something that shocked him more than anything else that had happened since his capture. She bowed her head in greeting, not in submission or mockery, but in simple respect. Then she spoke, and her words would change everything. She said that she wanted to understand. She said that she wanted to know why he had fought and what he had lost and who he had been before the war turned him into a weapon. She said that she was not there to judge him. She was there to listen. Kethron stared at this tiny human and felt something crack inside his chest. For the first time in his life, someone was looking at him not as a monster or a warrior or an enemy. Someone was looking at him as a person, and he did not know how to respond to that.